Hey everyone, my name is Peter. I'm a program manager on the Windows Virtual Desktop team, and I have the privilege to spend the last session together with you. And we'll be talking about everything that we recently announced, but we'll also spend a minute or two to talk about what's coming. So, with that, let's just get started. One of the announcements we did is all around the availability of our service instances. So a while ago, we already talked about having our management planes deployed in the US, in the EU, in Japan, Australia, Asia Pacific, and Brazil. And since then, we also expanded to South Africa, UK, France, Germany, Norway, and Korea. And all of this is to make sure that you have the lowest latency as possible. Because every connection you make initially goes through the management plane and then to the VM that lives in your subscription. So having a management plane that's close to you is critical to making sure you have a good experience. Now we're not stopping here. So by the end of the year, we'll have deployed in additional regions, including the United Arab Emirates, Canada, and Switzerland. So if you're one of those regions, you can expect a lower latency and hopefully a better experience. The cool thing about this, by the way, is that you don't have to do anything. If you have an existing WVD infrastructure or deployment, we'll make sure that the traffic is just routed to the closest management plane. So there's nothing for you to redeploy or reconfigure. Microsoft will take care of that. So that's a very important thing. Then let's talk about the next one, which is all about Teams. Now, as you probably are aware of, is without any optimizations for any collaboration tool that includes audio and video, such as Teams, in a virtualized environment, that can definitely give you some challenges. And with Teams, it's no different. So one of the things we've done is worked on optimizations. I'll explain in a second what that is. But before we go there, what you can see here is a demo of a non-optimized experience. So on the left side, you can see Teams, which is running in a VM in WVD. And on the right side, you can see Task Manager. And by default, it hovers around, let's say 10% CPU usage. And even with that, specific functionality is almost unusable. Like try using audio if Teams is running in a remote session, and that won't really work well. And that's mostly because we rely, or Teams relies on echo cancellation, which is very latency sensitive. And as soon as you kind of take the end user and the VM or where the application is running apart from each other, that tends to fail. So what we've done is we've worked together with the Teams team, making sure that all of the audio and video is being offloaded through the local client. So instead of the traffic being routed from you to the VM and the VM to potentially someone else's VM back to the user, we now use WebRTC, and we can just directly communicate from your endpoint to someone else's, even if they're connected to a VM where Teams is running. So this is great on making sure you have a better experience. Now we can also see that in Task Manager. So here you can see Teams, which is optimized for WVD. And in the same example, so exactly the same setup, except now we're using the optimized version of Teams, you can see that the CPU utilization is hovering around 1% maybe. So this is a significant investment, significant improvement on making sure that we can have a great user experience, but not impact the user density. Now, the next thing that we announced during Ignite is all about Microsoft Endpoint Manager, and then specifically Intune. This is one of the asks that we had as well, is how to manage WVD VMs. So here's what we announced and what's coming later. The first thing is right now you can use Intune as part of Microsoft Endpoint Manager if you want to manage Windows 10 Enterprise VMs on WVD. So just single session, not multi-session yet. And by the way, I mentioned Intune, but you can also use Config Manager. So it's just Microsoft Endpoint Manager in general. Maybe you've invested in the Intune tool or Config Manager. You can use either or both. It's up to you. Now, regarding multi-session, what we're planning is a public preview later this calendar year. And that means you can use Intune with Windows 10 Enterprise multi-session and deploy device-based policies. And I'm adding that specifically because deploying user-based policies is something that's coming next calendar year. That has some additional challenges on our side. Let me give you an example. Let's say you define two conflicting policies. For example, the Windows firewall has to be opened or the Windows firewall has to be closed. And you deploy that to two different groups of users, and now all of a sudden, two users from those two groups start authenticating or logging on to one multi-session VM. There's only one firewall, and yet users will have conflicting policies. So what's going to happen? Well, guess what? All bets are off. It depends on who logs on first or last. So it's a bit of a mess. So that's why initially what we will do is only support device-based targeting. So you can only target policies and apps and settings to devices. Now, luckily, I'm not sure about you, but in all the conversations I've been having with customers and partners, the vast majority for these type of environments are already deploying against device groups and not user groups. So if you're belonging to that category, fine, great. Um, Later this calendar year, we'll open up a public preview and we're inviting you um, to play around with the technology. If you also want to deploy user-based policies, then I'd recommend to wait until next calendar year. That's when we expect to ship this feature as well. Now, just to show you what the Microsoft Endpoint Manager experience would be like, what I've done in advance is I've authenticated to this MAM page. So I can zoom in a little bit so everyone can hopefully see it fine. But here you can see my devices. And if I go to all devices, there's quite a bunch. Like this tenant has a lot of devices enrolled. Now, what I remember is if I go to the last page, I'll see a bunch of WVD VMs. So here you can see, you can tell by the name, of course, is that these are all WVD VMs. And this is the new thing. They're now managed by Intune. Now, if we just drill down on one of these VMs, just to see what the configuration is like, we can see if we go to compliance, that a few compliance policies have been assigned. So one is a Windows 10 WVD compliance policy. So let's just see what's part of that. And here we can see that we have 3 settings configured. So apparently this IT admin has configured that the Defender AV, the anti-malware, has to be enabled, configured specific antivirus settings, so some configuration within Defender AV, and then specified a specific minimum operating system version. And guess what? These VMs comply with this policy, which is good. And you can use things like conditional access, making sure that users only have access to resources if they comply with the policy specified. Now, the same thing goes with apps. Like if I go to apps, I can do a bunch of things. I can just add a new application. What I'd like to do as a demo is just go to M365 Apps, which is the new name for Office Pro Plus. Go to Windows 10, hit select, and here I'll just walk through the basic settings. So for demo purposes, what we can do is just select the current channel and then just maybe select one application. Let's just go for Teams. And here if we go to assignment and then review and create, sorry, I have to go back. I have to add a group, otherwise no one's going to get it. And here I've defined a user group. So again, this is targeting Windows 10 Enterprise WVD VMs, not multi-session yet. Here I can hit select, next, and then just create. And as a result, all of the users that are using these VMs will have Teams installed. So you'll see that this is very similar to managing physical devices, and that's exactly what we're trying to achieve here. So that was a quick Microsoft Endpoint Manager demo. Let's go back to the deck. Another thing which we haven't talked about a lot, but we should, it's WVD Quick Start. It's a website. I've already pre-opened it, so if we go there, you just browse to wvdquickstart.com and you will end up on this page. And what this will allow you to do is to quickly deploy a complete WVD environment. Because as you might know, I'm sure you've played around with WVD, there's tons of steps you need to do. And sometimes it's better if we have an automation tool like this. Now, it's explained over here what it does. I won't go through it in detail, But the most important bit is if you hit getting started, here you can go left or right. And it depends a little bit on what you're trying to achieve. If you don't have anything deployed whatsoever and you just want to get a WVD environment deployed quickly, you can hit empty subscription. So you'll bring an empty subscription or credentials, therefore. And what we'll do in the background is we'll establish a complete Azure DevOps pipeline that will just deploy a couple of things, including Azure Active Directory domain services um, or Azure ATTS. It will also deploy one host pool with two VMs in it, and it will also use FS logics or configure FS logics on Azure files. And that's just with a couple of mouse clicks providing some details, but not a lot. Now, if you don't want to use Azure ADDS or you have an existing infrastructure that you want to tie into, you can hit existing setup. And then you'll provide some information as well, like username, passwords of domain accounts or an account that has enough privileges to domain join a VM, and some other things. And then you run this thing, and about 30, 45 minutes later, you'll have a very similar environment as we just discussed. Here you can see how it works. If I would hit deploy to Azure, it will bring me to this template. And the only thing I'll have to do is enter a few details. Let me show you. Here's the information you'll need to provide, and it's not a lot. So you can tell I'm not going to go through all of the settings, but basically you have to make sure this was the second option, by the way. The first one's even smaller. So here you have to provide your VNet name, subnet, the resource group, credentials to make sure that we can domain join VMs. And you can choose what kind of identity solution you'd like to use, Active Directory or Azure ADDS. And at the end, provide an email address so we can send you an email when the deployment is done. So this is a pretty cool tool. This, by the way, is something that is not officially supported by Microsoft yet. It's something we're planning to do, but right now it's more of a community effort. So if you have any questions or feedback, please let us know. This is built on GitHub, so you can also just leave your comments behind in the tool itself. So with that, we're going to move on. Before we move on, some cool information. So we get some statistics based on the usage of the WVD Quick Start. And what I'd like is if you look on the deployment success rate chart on the left, 90% succeeds, 10% fails. And we looked into the reasons on why these deployments fail. And what we can see is that the vast majority is because a username and password has been provided, which is simply incorrect. Well, that's something we will never be able to completely automate. So, pay attention, make sure you fill in the right credentials, and then your deployment should succeed. So let's move on to another announcement which we've done a couple of weeks ago. This is all about Defender ATP. So for those of you who are not super familiar with Defender ATP, it's a suite of inbox tools within Windows. Some of them, like the next generation antivirus, is something we've invested in heavily. So if you are looking for an antivirus, or if you have an existing antivirus product, but you're looking at renewing it, also make sure you look at Defender AV. I know if we go back a couple of years, it didn't have the great or the best name in town or the best reputation. It has changed. Microsoft has invested in Defender AV a lot. So please do some research and look into it. Now, the other thing which is even more exciting is the endpoint detection and response, also called EDR. So while the first one, the antivirus, scans for known malware, which you need because there's a lot of stuff out there with signatures that we all know, and you can prevent a lot of stuff from happening or bad stuff from happening by scanning for known malware. EDR is slightly different. Instead of looking for known malware, it looks for suspicious behavior. What we're seeing now is that a lot of customers are being compromised by attackers that are very specifically targeting that customer or sometimes an industry. and they use more sophisticated tools. And a lot of times they're either unknown to antivirus or they're using what we call living off the land. So they're using tools that are part of Windows, PowerShell, for example. So EDR works slightly different. Instead of scanning for no malware, what it does, it looks for suspicious or um, just behavior which is not very common. I'll give you an example. Let's say you're working in Office and all of a sudden Office starts downloading an executable from the web, and all of a sudden then that machine starts port scanning a couple of other machines around that device, and then all of a sudden starts reaching out with usernames and passwords to another machine. I think we all agree that classifies as malicious or very suspicious behavior. So EDR, Microsoft Defender ATP, specifically the EDR component, will alert you. Now, one of the asks that we had a lot is, Microsoft, are you supporting Win10 multi-session with Defender ATP? And what we support today is up to 25 users. So if you have one VM with up to 25 users that log on simultaneously, you have full support for Defender ATP. You can use it. Now, will it break when you have user 26 logging on? It won't. It's just that the Defender ATP team will have to do more validation to make sure that they can make sure that none of the events are being dropped because too much events are being generated. That's one. The other thing is within the portal, we have to make some optimizations for this share or big amount of users that authenticate to one VM. Right now, the portal isn't optimized for that, so we're making some changes. And by the way, those changes are expected for the second half of this calendar year. So hopefully we can call this GA later this calendar year. Now, if we move on to Security Center, this is also a pretty cool feature. What Security Center does is it can scan your complete subscription within Azure and can give you recommendations on what can be improved. Now, this is almost low-hanging fruit. Azure Security Center has two models. One is the free and the other one is paid. You get more insights with the paid version, but the free version is already supplying you with lots and lots of information. I'll give you an example. So what I've done is I've opened, let me find the right tab. I've opened the Azure portal over here. Let me zoom in a little bit like I did earlier. And if I search for Security Center, this is Azure Security Center. And I've enabled this a couple of days ago, and you can see it scanned my whole subscription, and it doesn't look good, to be honest. I have a lot of fixing to do. Now, it can give you a secure score, which is helping you to motivate you to take action, and based on every action you take, which increases your security posture, you'll get some more points. And we all know how it works. We all want to have the most points, so I think it's a very clever way on increasing the security posture by using that mental drive. But I'm not going to fall for it, not today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to click on these recommendations and just go directly into the high severity ones. And once I do that, you can see that I get some recommendations. Now, very important one, enable MFA. So what it detected is that some of my users, based on their Azure Active Directory identity, doesn't have MFA enabled. It gets you the most points because what we know because of experience is that if you have MFA enabled on an account, the likelihood of that identity being compromised is reduced a lot. So you can see there's a big list of things that I still have to work on. But anyway, this is a great way of making sure that your environment is more secure. Now let's talk about the shared image gallery. One of the things we heard as well from customers and partners is that it's kind of difficult to make sure your image is replicated to the place you want it to have. Maybe you want to deploy something in South Africa. Here's a quick example on where we actually are planning to do so. So instead of you uploading that to all these different regions, you can now take advantage of the shared image gallery. So in this case, you just jot in what the destination of your image should be, and the technology will take care of the replication. Whenever you deploy that VM in a specific region, given that the image is nearby, the deployment is a lot quicker. So it's very beneficial as well. Then another interesting thing is Quick Assist. I get a request every now and then, or someone asks me like, hey, what's the preferred way to deliver some kind of assistance? And we all know about shadow sessions, and there is a way to do that in WVD, but it's super quirky. Now, Quick Assist is something which is not new. It's part of Windows 10. It's an inbox tool, but it's pretty powerful. So what you can do is just on any Windows 10 device, you can find Quick Assist in the Start menu. So on the left side, you can see a person who's trying to deliver assistance. And on the right side, you can see a virtual desktop of a person that is in need of assistance. So on the left, this person started the application and a code is being generated. Now, whoever needs assistance is gonna jot in that same code, as you can see over here. And shortly after, we have a little flow that you'll see momentarily, where we'll have to make sure that we have the right set of permissions. You, as the person that's getting support, can decide whether that's only just view, maybe you just want to show something, or maybe you really want to have the other person the ability to drive and make sure that they can make changes. I think we've all been there with family members, and you always have to think about how do I give them access, or how do I get access to a specific PC? Well, guess what? We now have an inbox tool that allows you to do so. It's pretty powerful. So here you can see the end result of a user who is driving a user session, and on the right you can see the actual thing happening. So it's a useful tool that you can use just for troubleshooting purposes, or like mentioned before, if you just want to view something. Another thing we've been working on, and by the way, we're not finished yet. We're still getting, or we're just getting started, is the making sure we have a good scaling solution. The worst thing you want to do is just keep your VMs running 24/7 if that's not needed. So with our scaling service, you can now completely customize on how you want to have VMs running, maybe in the morning or shutting down later on, scale up and down using specific thresholds. If you want to learn more about this specific feature, you can find a link at the bottom, aka MS WVD Auto Scale, and that will explain you how to set it up. And like mentioned before, we're doing more to make sure this is even easier, but for now, this is a perfect way of saving costs. In terms of monitoring, also a great example of an ask from the market. A lot of times, third-party tools were used to make sure you can get the information like memory usage or CPU, or just in general, like how's the user density? Can I maybe jam in more people on a given VM, or maybe less? Maybe that thing is already at capacity. And if it's at capacity, of course, you can do several things. You can reduce the amount of people that log on to a given VM, but you could also maybe scale up, just go into the Azure portal, assign more vCPUs and more memory. And the nice thing is you can just do that with a couple of mouse clicks. One reboot and that thing has more memory and more CPUs. And of course, you can scale down as well. Another thing that we announced at Ignite is the Start VM on Connect. And sometimes we do naming right, and this is a great example because it does exactly what the feature sounds like. We can start a VM whenever you connect. So imagine that you have a VM that's deallocated, so it doesn't consume any CPU. So it's only a little bit of storage you pay for. And whenever the user connects to the service, then the VM will boot up. And of course, it takes a little while, but the user will then get access to the VM. So that works great for personal desktops. And it's super easy to configure. You can see it here on the screen. It's just one tick box or one button that you hit, and that feature is enabled. Now there's more coming. We have a public roadmap that explains publicly what it is that's coming next. Now we're also working on getting more stuff in the public roadmap because this, if you go there now, you see two items, which is about latency improvement, basically deploying our management plane in other regions. But there's way more going on behind the scenes. Like we're making optimizations in Windows. Let me just start at the top. We have migrations commandlets coming soon, which means that if you deployed WVD previously before we had the Spring update, maybe you have workloads running that you don't want to decommission or rebuild. And with these migration commandlets, that's not required. You can have them running as part of the classic release that we shipped a while ago, and then run these scripts. And they can even simulate a migration, or they can migrate it. If you don't like it, they can even roll back. And the other cool thing about it is that it doesn't touch the session hosts. It's not invasive. It doesn't change your networking whatsoever. So the risk of this thing breaking the end user productivity is fairly low. And there's a couple of modes that you can try to make sure that your migration is going in a very well controlled way. Then I already alluded to it is WinTab multi-session performance. We're constantly making efforts to make sure that we increase the user density. A lot of times we're hearing, well, why don't you have, we have all these scripts out there, and if you run them, you get 10%, 20% better user density. And while that might be true, a lot of those scripts, they also do funky things that we would never recommend our customers, like disable firewalls, disable antivirus. So we've been looking at those as well. But ideally, we work with the team that owns the code and make sure that they optimize for WinTab multi-session or just multi-session scenarios in general. That's the better path, although it takes a little bit more time. The other thing, and Christian already talked about it, is MSIX app attach. So all about, that's more of a long-term vision, is how can we make sure that everything is more modular. So you have the operating system, then on top of it, you have the profiles, which is mounted using FS Logics. And on top of that, you have applications that are also mounted or attached using very similar technology. Now, if we can modularize, make everything more modular, it means that maintenance is also a lot easier. You can just, after Patch Tuesday, just pull down the latest gallery image because we update those every month after Patch Tuesday, and then layer on top, profiles, applications, and then make them available to users. That's our North Star in terms of imaging. Azure AD support for VMs is also probably the number one ask at this moment. Just to make sure everyone understands what that means, right now, if you use WVD and you authenticate for the first time against the client, so the first time you authenticate, that's done against Azure AD identities, so users. That's already a requirement for WVD. And we've done it specifically because that allows us to just layer on top conditional access and multi-factor authentication. So it's super easy to secure that even more. Now, once you go through that initial connection, we broker into AD, just classic, stuff that we've been doing for 20 years, domain joined VMs. And we did that because that was the number one ask from our customers and our partners. But now we're hearing different requests, which is all about making sure that we get access to Azure AD joined VMs. And that will give you several benefits. One is we can get end-to-end single sign-on. We can also do that with AD joined, but it requires ADFS and all kinds of things we unless you have it, but otherwise we wouldn't recommend to deploy it today. So with Azure AD join, we can give you that single sign-on experience, and it doesn't require an AD in line of sight. So that means less cost. If you're an ISV or you're a hoster and you want to set up an environment for a small customer with maybe just a few seats, you don't want to install a domain controller in that subscription. That just drives up the costs a lot. So instead, you can deploy Azure AD joined VMs, and there's no DC required. And because there's no DC required, it also means less complexity. A lot of times we see deployments fail because DNS has not been configured correctly, username and passwords are entered incorrectly, VNets, or there's a bunch of issues, just prerequisites that have not been fulfilled correctly. And that's why when a VM tries to join to the domain, it cannot find the domain controller. Now there's much more. We're developing pretty quick in a high pace. So please make sure you stay tuned because more is coming. So with that, thank you very much for your attention, your time, and make sure you have a great day. Thank you.